Hey, everybody, welcome to a very special episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and joining me on the show, the general manager of the Minnesota Vikings, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. Kwesi, it's great to have you on the show for the very first time. I'm pulling you out of meetings here, so I'm happy that you could make time to jump on. I guess I want to start out by just saying, it feels new around there. It feels fresh. It feels like one thing came to an end and another thing started with this draft. Does it feel that way for you?
I think that'll probably settle in when they arrive. I do feel that sense a little bit, but I also want to say that comes with a great appreciation for the people that came before them. I know you're specifically talking about the quarterback, but even just all the guys that have been here these first 2 years, built this culture, had us in the playoffs or competing for the playoffs right up until the last very minute. My admiration and appreciation for those guys will always remain. I always say tell those guys my relationships are not transactional. They have my number forever, and really just appreciate those guys. But I am happy about the new guys coming in. These guys are going to pick up the culture for the next foreseeable future for the Vikings, and I'm excited to add them to the group we added in free agency. The guys that they inherited on this team already. I'm just we're fortunate to bring in these guys.
It's probably so much different from any other sport when it comes to football. The amount of players that come and go, and Harrison Smith has talked about that over the years, where it seems like every year in his press conference we ask him, "So you lost this teammate signed somewhere else," and he said, like, that's just kind of how the league works. But I think about when you guys arrived to how different this is now, and especially because Kirk was here for so long, it feels like the Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, Kevin O'Connell team has been formed over the last couple of years. I was mentioning on the show the other day that I think that the hardest part starts now for you guys. Do you view it that way? That when you get the quarterback, it sort of starts a new timeline for you, and the hardest one is to really compete and really get to the top of the mountain. So how do you view that?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think, I think I'd always probably say that the hardest thing is the next thing, just because that's how we're wired. But in a sense, we've added some great names on a depth chart, but now it really involves bringing them in, nurturing them. Talk about a quarterback, we talk about environment all the time, and just making sure that we're not the reason that we fail. JJ, I really do believe that when you hire, great executives or quarterbacks, whatever it is, like, it's my job to not fail them. I've identified them as talented. We've identified them as talented. How do we make sure we don't fail him? And so, to your point, the hardest part is that. But looking at it, I have my board with, all our draft picks and cap space going forward. And you are kind of looking forward to the future and trying to think of when will be the optimal window for his performance and our performance, or, as a team. It's a lot. Obviously, it's a puzzle that I don't ultimately know the answer to. All your best laid plans can go out the window if anything deviates from normal, just like the draft. We got Sam coming in to compete day one, and I'm actually really optimistic about Sam and playing well, and we'll see what happens there. But ultimately, what you're saying is right. The hard part about planning this in a way that sets up for a timeline to ultimately go climb to the mountaintop. That's kind of what we came in and started to do in 2022, and now we're just in year 3 of that. I won't name it a plan or anything like that, but just we're in year 3 of it right now.
We're working on it. We're working on it for new names for the plan. You
Okay.
really handed it on a silver platter to us the first time. But when it came to the JJ McCarthy decision, I had a lot of fun because there's no pressure on me over the last couple of months, diving into every number I could find, reading everybody's opinion. And the one thing that was difficult for me with JJ McCarthy was just the lack of numbers to work with. When it came to the other prospects, it was right there. There were hundreds and hundreds of dropbacks, huge sample sizes. And it was just a struggle when you try to even section those things out. How many third down and longs? 100? How many plays under pressure? 50? And
Mhm.
I wonder, how did you guys deal with that issue, that the sample size with him specifically, it was very good, but it just wasn't very big?
No, it's absolutely right, and that was probably the struggle that I have, because so much of the analysis I do takes the assumption that on a game basis, guys are going to throw roughly the same amount of plays. Obviously, we have advanced metrics that do it on a per attempt basis, but that was a struggle. It really was, and I think you nailed it. I think when you go more to a thinner slice with cut ups, and maybe not third and long, third and 3+, red zone, non-drop back, or red zone, no play action, different things like that, where you can kind of make it as apples to apples as possible. And then we also just lean on our statistics that we have that are on a per play basis. Now, the hard part about those is I always joke, in NBA analysis, right? If there's a difference between efficiency and load. If you look at like a number two scorer who sits in the corner and you say, man, this guy's super efficient. Well, that's not the same load that Anthony Edwards has when the whole defense is looking to stop him and he's got to take shots at the end of the shot clock. Those are going to be harder shots. So always trying to make sure that, yeah, we have these metrics, but is it the same thing required of him as is required of other people? And honestly, there is no super smart right answer. There is just a dedicated approach to process information, listening to different viewpoints, and coming up with your evaluation at the end of the day that encompasses all those things.
Which ones mattered to you? Because I thought the third down stuff you could definitely make a case for, where it's, hey, it's on you, buddy. I think that under pressure in the NFL can be up and down, but in college, if it's really poor under pressure, I would pay attention to that. He was actually quite good under pressure. And even something that caught my eye too was his play action numbers, where he's turning his back to the defense, which you do not see very often when it comes to college football. And he was really excellent rolling out, throwing on the run. I think that those numbers would probably be the ones I would point to if I was making my case. If I was putting together like my JJ McCarthy dossier, I would say like, these are the ones that kind of stand out to me. Which one stood out to you?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. Obviously you start with the overall play as a baseline just to see what that is. But, after that, we focus a lot on third down, red zone. Now, within third down and red zone, you're typically going to see those under pressure plays, but under pressure is obviously something we look at. We identify, we have a term we use here where we call it conflict resolution, and then we look at metrics that kind of support that. Now, what's hard about that is conflict resolution isn't necessarily what everybody thinks it is. It's not always just somebody taking off and running. It's, some subtle plays that we talked about, in our time together, just maybe seeing a lineman about to get edge and taking that subtle two steps over and getting himself a throwing window, things like that. Because ultimately, when you look at a stat, that's only possible for what's available to them. So let's say that they can elude, but there's nobody open, and they do a throwaway. Well, that's going to show up as an EPA value of something or whatever it is. Well, versus somebody else who just happened to have somebody open. They made the same play, right? And so that's, again, a lot of the stuff we're doing, just like in baseball or basketball, you're trying to contextualize apples to apples to show ability. And if they were in a better circumstance, maybe the stats would have showed something else.
So Kevin O'Connell mentioned something interesting about the way that your thought process has impacted his thought process. I'd love to hear you talk about that, because we all made our culture of collaboration jokes when you guys talked about that getting here. But this was the huge thing going into this decision, is having everybody on board. So how did he take what he can do as far as analyzing film and breaking down the technique of a quarterback and pair that with the quantitative type analysis?
Yeah, I think it's funny. I call the quarterback as a marriage, and obviously me and him, that's a marriage. And so we spend a lot of time together. At some point, you start sounding the same, using the same language. But I think football is this beautiful thing where watching film, and we call it analytics, but it's all the same thing. A statistic is just a play that somebody describes something, yards, EPA, whatever it is. A coach can watch a play and describe it as good or bad. And then how do you contextualize that in the end? And then how do you use that context to make final decisions? So he kind of learned that from me, just my process being a data guy. When I had to learn how to scout, well, I was like, well, I'm a math guy. Well, how does a math guy scout? He takes evidence and he figures out how to use that evidence to make a decision. So just that process of how I set up our scouting culture, where how we talk about quarterbacks in terms of impact at every position, really. And then how do you provide evidence that support all those different things? And then, he's a special guy. I say it all the time. I don't think people realize that there's not many coaches in the league that would kind of roll their sleeves up and do the things that I've asked other people to do, that he kind of just sees value in it, and now he's doing. And like these are things that like your quality control coach might be asked to do. But he wants ownership over it, and he's just such a creative mind and just hardworking that he always wants to grow and learn, develop, and so he's taken that from me. But don't get this twisted for 1 second. I've learned a ton from him. Now I watch quarterback play, and I'm talking about base and different things like that, and things that I, obviously I would never know, before. But it's good to have that difference. I'll watch a play. We'll both come together and we'll compare our cut-ups, and we have the same play, but he's looking at 10 different things that I didn't see. And I'm looking at, well, he sees everything. I'm not going to lie, but there's 5 things that I probably saw that I focus more on, and maybe I say it a way that kind of hits him certainly. And that's why collaboration is great, because you cover each other's blind spots. You come from a different worldview and you come together, and it's a beautiful thing. But he's taken to a lot of the stuff I've done from a process standpoint, but I've learned so much from him. It's mutual.
Yeah, I think you spend a few minutes with Kevin and you realize how much you don't know about quarterback play.
Unbelievably
Yeah,
so,
in
man.
in comparison, I wanted to ask you, when you got to San Francisco, about your experience there, combining what you could do mathematically with understanding where the football people are coming from. Because I did a little stuff when I was reporting with analytics with a hockey team, where the coach asked me, "Hey, can you show me some of these numbers you're writing?" And I went into his office thinking, I'm going to tell this guy all the line combinations, and I'm going to change this team. And about 5 minutes in, I was like, now I understand why you're doing the things you're doing. And it's a hit. You're like, oh, okay. I get this at a lot better level. What was that like for you, taking what you could do data wise and then like pairing that early on? Or how did that hit you when you got to San Francisco and started to learn how some of the other stuff works behind the scenes?
No, that's exactly right. I was fortunate enough to come from a trading background where humility is beaten into you on a daily basis, that you don't know everything. 40% of the time when you're good, you lose. And so you're always saying, well, somebody else who's just as smart as me decided to buy when I decided to sell. So I never walk into rooms thinking I've got it all figured out. But when I got to San Francisco, obviously I was tasked with kind of elevating some of their things quantitatively. And I started with scouting reports, just helping them how to quantify what other teams do. But the first thing I did was grab a couple coaches and say, hey, how do you look at other teams? How do you come up with your plan? Always start there. I always call it the what and the why. The what's the numbers, but you got to understand the why to make the what kind of match. So that was always my approach. And then in a scouting sense, Ethan Waugh, who's somebody I always name and mention because he was really impactful to me earlier in my career. He was analytically minded. He's now the assistant GM of the Jaguars, but he's analytically minded. So he would kind of pick my brain about what I was doing, and that would allow me to pick his brain. Now, some of it was for him just not agreeing with some of what my models came up with. Hey, here's why this guy's good, and me seeing that and being like, okay, well, let me see if I can try and incorporate this context that I'm missing. I'd be in meetings with Kyle in a team meeting, and just seeing how he talked about the game made my modeling better, because I'm at some point there's only so much football I know, but now I hear it from him, and him talking about a wide zone play and why this matters versus this. I'm like, well, wow, could I quantify that? And then now I'm off for the next 3 months trying to quantify this really small thing to make our models marginally better, which would make our outcomes marginally better. So that was kind of my process there. At the time you're going through it, it's tough because you're coming with a perspective that other people don't have, and there's sometimes is that I don't want to say adversarial, but just not able to communicate what I mean. And I got so much better after the fact, and I have such great relationships with all those guys now. We talk about those old days and how much we all learn from each other. Really, I wouldn't be here without all those people and all those interactions.
So, what was the biggest adjustment when you got the job here as general manager? Again, I think people think that you just make all the decisions and you have your laptop in there and you go trade. But I don't think it works that way quite. But how far have you come over the last couple of years?
That's exactly right. I think these are buildings, these are organizations. There's a lot of people whose livelihoods are at stake with whatever happens when I hit that button. And you got to build consensus. But consensus is hard because not everybody's going to agree. Football's a sport where it's complex and there's a lot of different ideas that people can have, and they're right. But we got to make one decision, and you got to. I've tried to take this definition of consensus to mean you don't all have to agree, but we all have to live with it and support it. How do we get us to a place where we can all live with it and support it and understand the why behind, hey, and validating people who want to go left, even when I want to go right. And from my standpoint, I'm just wired to be open-minded. I just from my experiences in life, when somebody smart challenges an opinion I have, I go do more work. I go take what they've said, and I have a process for figuring that out. And sometimes you come out and say, look, I see what you see. Here's why I think the answer is going to be different. But I just think it's irresponsible of the leader to hire talented people and then not take their opinion to mean something. So I'd say that's probably the biggest area of growth, being open-minded, but at some point you got to just decide and make a decision, and just know that you're going to be the most accountable person in the room. And good or bad, left or right, up or down, you live with that. That's definitely been a growth area for me.
I think just overall being the guy who's managing lots of people versus a contributor to
Yep.
management is
Yep.
a very different situation. One more thing for you. So you're a big Wolves fan now
Yep.
and watching the NBA a lot. You and I debated over Anthony Edwards' comp. Personally, for me, it's Vince Carter. You think he'd be better. Everybody's saying it's Michael Jordan. That's a little much for me. It's a little much for me considering when I grew up watching Michael Jordan. But when you look over at them, at the Wolves and where they are now, that's where you want this team to be. You want people to be talking about your best players as Michael Jordan and competing for a championship. Is there anything you take from them and take from how they do things, how they have built that roster to be in this position where they are now?
100%. I talk to Tim often. Just become a good friend, a really great guy. But I will go back to the Anthony Edwards thing. I grew up the same era as you did. There's a couple times he makes a couple moves where I'm just like, I know what that looks like, man. And like, you don't want to say it because we revere the goats for a good reason, but man, there's a couple times where you're just like, I know what that looks like. That feels really familiar. And he's got the dog mindset. I know people questioned it coming out, but I don't know. I watch a player who's trying to put a team on his back and go win a championship. But I take a lot from their team building. They have a lot of core pieces, obviously that one main piece, but they also took some risk with the Rudy Gobert trade, which people, there's always going to be things that you do that are kind of within the lines. But every organization, I believe, to get to that top of the mountaintop is going to take something that's going to take some bet, some risk, something that's outside the lines that people are going to be a little nervous about. But that's what a sport designed for everybody to go 500. You kind of got to do something to swing outside. And look, when you take that swing, that also can give you some odds of going back the other way. But like sitting in the middle probably isn't necessarily always the right thing to do. So taking that, their approach has been just awesome. Just awesome to watch from afar.
Well, I guess that's Dallas Turner versus draft charts, what you might be describing there. But after taking a look at Dallas Turner, I think that might work out. So, but anyway, we could talk analytics for hours for sure. But I just thank you for coming on. Really appreciate all of your time. And look, it's okay if you want to label the next thing. It's all right if you want to give us something to work with. Competitive rebuild. I'll tell you this: it was actually really helpful. You may have hated how many times we said it, but we understood the plan much better and could see it play out. So give yourself a little credit for that. Your time, your open and honesty at the podium sometimes.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it. And I always enjoy the questions you ask me, really thoughtful. It's always sometimes nice to get I get a little nerd crutch up there because I know you're going to get me something that I can, talk through. And so really always appreciate you up there, man.
Absolutely. Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, thanks so much for coming on.
Our boss.